Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of MMT Mondays. This week we're going to discuss the absurdity of a balanced budget amendment, but I want to start off with a quick story. So last week, I had a really interesting moment with my students after one of them asked me if I had heard that the national debt was getting close to $28 trillion. So I told them that's great. Their reaction was priceless, and I could tell that I finally had managed to pierce the abyss that teaching on Zoom has created, if only for a second. So while I had that attention, I told them that debt isn't necessarily a bad thing. I went on to explain that our national government isn't like state governments or a household because we don't need to balance those checkbooks each year. So after feeling really old for a second when a student asked me what exactly a checkbook was, I went on to explain how deficit spending is not a bad thing. Federal deficits mean that more dollars are being funneled into households or Venmos to put it on their level. I still had a few skeptical faces, so I went even further to explain about debt not being a bad thing and how our entire national banking system was actually built on that. So if you still don't believe me, just ask this guy.
How does a bastard orphan son of a whore and a Scotsman dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by providence, impoverished in squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter. By 14 they had placed him in charge of the trade and charter, and every day while slaves were being slaughtered or carted away across the waves, our Hamilton kept his guard up. Inside he was longing for something to be a part of. The brother was ready to beg, steal, borrow, or barter. Then a hurricane came and devastation reigned, and our man saw his future dripping down the drain. Put a pencil to his temple, connected it to his brain, and he wrote his first refrain, a testament to his pain. Well, the word got around, they said this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came, and the world is gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton.
That's right, our nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. So in 1790, the new nation was awash in government IOUs, but had little cash or coinage for any daily commerce. Alexander Hamilton resolved this crisis with a simple argument. He reminded his fellow founders that debts are also assets, and that the most secure assets are those that yield a guaranteed income stream from a sovereign government with the power to tax. So, as Alexander Hamilton saw it, a national debt, if not excessive, will be a national blessing. Throughout our nation's history, not everyone has shared that same sentiment, though. As one of his last acts before mercifully retiring next year, Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama recently introduced a balanced budget amendment just like he has done in every single Congress since 1987. Shelby believes that in order to get our financial house in order, the government must break the cycle of deficit spending, except for a few caveats.
President, I rise today to introduce a piece of legislation that I have introduced in every Congress since 1987. A proposed constitutional amendment requiring Congress to balance our nation's budget. This bill has bipartisan support and will allow us to finally begin, Mr. President, to get our fiscal house in order. A balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, I believe, is the only certain mechanism that will break the cycle of deficit spending. I believe, Mr. President, that we must ensure that the government does not continue to saddle our children and our grandchildren with the current generation's debt. Essentially, this amendment that I've proposed requires that the United States not spend more money than it receives in revenue, except in times of war or when suspended by a vote of 3/5 of both houses of Congress.
These caveats being in time of war or when 3/5 of Congress approves of it. So these supposed deficit hawks are okay to suspend balanced budgets in times of war in order to continue the military-industrial complex. This shows that Shelby and the other deficit hawks could give two shits about deficits. It's also no coincidence that Senator Shelby's latest political contributions from 2020 came from defense contractors Lockheed Martin, which ranked number 1 with nearly $150,000, followed by Raytheon Technologies, General Dynamics Defense Contractors, and Oshkosh Not B'gosh Defense Productions. There's clearly a correlation between Shelby's approval of deficit spending and the fact that he is receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars from defense contractors that stand to benefit from these lucrative contracts with the government. So in return, Shelby has voted to reauthorize the increase in military funding each year that he has been in office. Now, all of this could easily just be a coincidence, right? But I'll let you decide.
Unfortunately, we do not have to look back far in history to see an example of a once great empire sitting on the curb with its hand held out. Greece's excessive public spending, coupled with a massive borrowing campaign, has put its fiscal insolvency woes on the entire European Union. Greece's bond rating was downgraded to junk by S&P in April. Bondholders were warned that they could recover as little as 30% of their initial investment. The euro weakened and the European stock markets plunged. Mr. President, the question is, will the dollar soon be seen as junk to the rest of the world? I hope not.
Senator Shelby claims that Greece's credit rating tanked, so will the U.S. be seen as junk soon as well? What he doesn't get is that the U.S. is a sovereign currency issuer and Greece is tied to the euro. Our dollar cannot become worthless because we are not tied to another country's currency.
American taxpayers are rightly infuriated by the federal government's disregard for the same, Mr. President's, economic principles that govern every household and business budget. Until the federal government is required to spend only the amount of money that it takes in, I fear that we will continue to write checks that the Treasury cannot cash. In the year 2010, the total interest alone on the Treasury debt securities was $413 billion. I believe this money could be better spent on improving education, supporting our law enforcement, or even better, by returning it to the people who earned it, the taxpayers. Mr. President, we hear on a daily basis the rhetoric about tough choices, sacrifice, and austerity. What we need to hear more about, I think, is basic mathematics when we're talking about the budget. A balanced budget amendment to the Constitution is the solution, I believe, to a perpetual problem that we do not have the political will to fix. It will finally put our nation on a path to paying off our national debt. The adoption of an amendment that would require the federal government to do what every American already has to do, balance its checkbook, is exactly what this country needs to prove that Washington is serious about accomplishing this feat. A balanced budget amendment is simply a promise to the American people that the government will spend their hard-earned tax dollars responsibly.
Shelby believes that the federal government should spend only the amount that it takes in. But once again, the federal government is not like a household because we can literally not run out of money. These platitudes are only seen as a way to keep the people docile and unaware of what is truly going on. Shelby also worries that the U.S. will write checks that they cannot cash. So can you please tell me one time that this has ever happened in our nation's history? I'm going to sit here. I'm going to wait. In our next video, we see Professor L. Randall Wray and Steve Grumbine of Real Progressives discussing how a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution would be truly unworkable and disastrous. Wray explains that it's doubtful that the U.S. government can even balance the budget. They can try, but the reduced deficits will result in recession and a slower economic growth in the private sector, which will automatically grow the deficit back. So it's just counterproductive. Wray also thoroughly debunks Senator Shelby's example of Greece. Their attempt at cutting spending and raising taxes to balance the budgets is why Greece is now in a worse condition than the U.S. Great Depression. Further attempts to balance the budget have only made this disaster that happened in Greece worse. So, to simply put it, it's just unnecessary. The U.S. government is the issuer of the U.S. dollar. it floats the exchange rate, and has no foreign denominated debt. Between these three conditions, it is impossible for the government to be forced to default on its debt. It is impossible for the U.S. government to run out of dollars, and at conditions of less than full employment, it's unnecessary for the government to raise taxes to pay for programs.
Because you mentioned the balanced budget and the sectoral balance.
Yes.
So yeah, if we ever did enact a balanced budget amendment and were able to actually hit this, now that's questionable whether we can hit it, but let's say that we could hit it. The United States, at any reasonable growth rate, is going to have a trade deficit. This is just the reality of the world right now today. We can go into why that's true, but when our economy is doing well, our trade deficit will hit 6 to 8% of GDP. When we're doing poorly, it falls to 3 or 4% of GDP. If the government has a balanced budget, and we have something slightly broader than a trade deficit, it's called a current account deficit, a balanced government budget and a current account deficit of 5%, by definition, by accounting identity, the private sector, taken as a whole, is going to be running a deficit of 5% of GDP, equal to that current account deficit. Private sector deficits are very rare and extremely dangerous. We had a private sector deficit essentially from 1996 until 2006. And that was one of the fundamental causes of the global financial crisis. We crashed when the private sector no longer could service their debt and people started defaulting on excessive debt. We don't even need the defaults. All we need is for people to realize, hey, I'm too far in debt. I'm going to stop borrowing. I'm going to start repaying my debt. The economy will crash as soon as that happens, if you have a balanced budget and a current account deficit. So the problem, this is what we learned from Win Godley sectoral balances, is that at the aggregate level, balances have to balance. For every deficit, there has to be a surplus. Okay? For every surplus, there has to be a deficit. So if the government is going to run a balanced budget, but we have a deficit with the rest of the world, the rest of the world has a surplus against us, then our private sector will be in deficit, going further and further into debt. And that is extremely dangerous for the economy because it creates financial problems, financial instability, as Minsky said. So that is why you have to understand the sectoral balances and what you're implying by saying the government will always balance its budget. Essentially, you're saying that means the private sector can never balance its budget. It will always have a deficit in the case of the United States.
In our next video, we see a speech from way back in 1995 where Senator Bernie Sanders not only echoes the arguments of Dr. Ray made in our previous video, but he also explains who would be hurt the most with the balanced budget amendment. See if you can notice any similarities to the issues that our country faces today that we did back in 1995.
The balanced budget amendment approach being brought forth by the Republican majority within the context of asking, as I understand it, for a $60 billion increase in military spending and major tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country, leads all serious economists to the conclusion that the balanced budget amendment will be a disaster for working people, for elderly people, for low-income people. It will mean, in my view, the destruction of the Social Security system as we know it. It will mean savage cuts in Medicare, in Medicaid, in the opportunity of young people to get grants and loans to go to college. It will mean major cutbacks in nutrition programs for hungry children. It will tamper with the unemployment compensation program, as we heard earlier. It will be a disaster for the vast majority of the people in this country. The economy is not booming. The standard of living of middle America and working people is in decline. Unemployment is far higher than the official statistics indicate. It seems to us to be very foolhardy to take away an option of the federal government that we may wish to use, which says that when our physical and human infrastructure is in collapse, when our mass transportation system is in so much need, when our roads are falling apart, when our bridges are collapsing, that it does not make sense to take away the option that the United States Congress may wish to use, and which the Progressive Caucus believes is necessary to rebuild the physical and human infrastructure of America.
So as you can see, from the days of our founding fathers and ever since, those in power know that federal government is not setting up future generations for failure, but rather MMT helps to explain the idea that the federal government has as much responsibility to protect its citizens' human rights as it does to protect their economic rights. The final video tonight, featuring Dr. L. Randall Wray once again, will leave you with a very important question that we all should ask ourselves. If politicians know that the federal government cannot go broke, why do they refuse to admit it and then act on it as well?
Even people who sort of understand what we're talking about are afraid to come out in the open and say things that they think would be politically very difficult cases to make. And so I think that's a problem with our elected representatives. I have met with progressive Democrat politicians over the past 25 years. And when we start talking about budget deficits, they completely understand that a sovereign government is not like a household. They understand that there's no necessity to balance the budget over the course of a year or ever. But they say, look, I can't say that in public because the response, they don't say of the funders, but I suppose funders are a big part of the problem, will be just overwhelmingly negative. They will think that I'm crazy. I can't say it in public. And so that is a big part of the problem.
So if you enjoyed tonight's video, make sure to check us out at realprogressives.org and subscribe to get notifications on new video streams in YouTube, Periscope, Facebook, and Rockfin. Thank you and have a great week.